welcome to Religious Studies Asks. This is a little segment that I'm doing to familiarize students with faculty and just the religious studies community so they can learn about your research and your interests. And so thank you for being here with me today. To begin, would you please just introduce yourself and tell us little bit about your story and how you came to be sitting here at Penn State studying and teaching religious studies and what sort of motivated you to pursue a career in religious studies?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Kristen, for inviting me to do this. So my name is Professor Michael Beshay. I'm in the Classics Ancient Mediterranean Studies department. This is my second year as an assistant professor in that department. Prior to that, I was actually a high school teacher in San Francisco for 2 years. It was one of those high schools that actually had a religion department. So there I also taught courses on the academic study of religion, alongside other fun things like ethics and moral decision making and IB theory of knowledge and those sorts of things. But before that, I was a graduate student at Ohio State, and before that, an undergraduate at UCLA. And that's really where the journey begins for me. I was one of those students who came into college with very little idea of what I would do there. But being someone of Middle Eastern descent, and maybe others can relate to this, it's pretty obvious to my parents and everyone else that I was going to do med school. If not that, then engineering. So those are the two tracks where I started. But I always had this interest in studying religious traditions. I grew up in a religious family, and it was a part of my life and part of my community. And when I decided to take the major in college, I thought this would basically be a way that I learned to catalog the philosophical traditions of every religion. But happily, I found that that wasn't the case, right? It's a very interdisciplinary field. I had a chance to take a little bit of history, a little bit of anthropology. Yes, philosophy was part of it, but there was also psychology. There was a bit of everything. And I still remember when I took the course in theory and methods in the study of religion, my third year, thinking about the way that the concept itself has developed over time, the way that people have treated the category and examined it, and what questions they've marshaled, what sort of evidence they pursued. It was just like the veil was being lifted, and I could sort of see the code behind the matrix. It was so enlightening that I decided then and there that this is what I was going to pursue. And then on top of that, I started taking ancient languages, Greek first and Latin, and I was fortunate to be able to do Coptic, and I kind of fell in love with that aspect of it as well, the historical research. And so, yeah, before I knew it, I was off to graduate school, and the rest is history.
Mhm. I always think it's cool how there's usually like that one class that really just changed like your entire life and the way that you look at the world. And yeah, thank you. And so I want to know more about the sort of classes that you do teach. And being at Penn State, which, as we know, is a very big secular institution, I'm curious about if there are any specific methods or strategies that you find effective when teaching to a secular audience and
Mhm.
teaching courses through a secular lens.
Yeah, definitely. So the courses I teach really revolve around the history of early Christianity, and that's my specialty. So I study the history of Christianity by approaching it, by situating it in a broader sort of cultural arena. So I'd like to claim that I am, first of all, historian of ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern religions. Think everything just a little before Jesus and just a little after Muhammad. But my concentration is on the history of Christianity, and so those are the courses I teach most. New Testament, early medieval Christianity. Last semester, I taught a first year seminar on ancient magic. I'll come back to that later. Teaching a new seminar, upper level CAMS course this year on lost Christianities. So think about all those varieties of early Christianity that come to be labeled heretical or heterodox, and so on and so forth. And so in each one of these, I start with a similar approach, which is thinking about the historiography of the field. Right. Because it's important to consider what makes a historical or critical or academic approach to religion distinctive from other approaches. And I find that thinking about how those approaches, those methods developed historically is just as important to understanding why we do what we do at a secular institution that it pursues an academic discourse on religion versus, say, a more theological context. So, for example, in the history of Christianity, I usually start by demonstrating to students that the modern academic critical study, secular study of Christianity actually emerges in a theological context, mostly by liberal Protestants who are interested in determining precisely the meaning of scriptures in order so that they can build some theological interpretation or derive moral exhortations or whatever the thing might be. So that these are not so much at odds as we sometimes think, but they are distinct methods, right? And my goal is that students can recognize the boundary between these disciplines and then feel the freedom to navigate between these options and occasionally even integrate them if they wish, right? And that's the point. I just want to equip my students with um, various methods to appreciate these traditions and take them quite seriously.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that is really important. So you mentioned magic.
Sure.
So can you kind of explain, like when you say magic in a religious studies or in a view of early Christianity, like what are you talking about? Are we supposed to think of something relating to Harry Potter or what
Sure,
is
why not?
magic to you? Yeah, tell us a little bit
Yeah,
about that.
that's the million-dollar question. So, like a lot of the categories in religious studies, even religion itself, they're so difficult to define. It's the same also with magic, right? Maybe especially so because magic historically has been one of those categories that is usually defined as the other. And so, where one person practices religion or ritual, and where one religious figure performs miracles, the other doesn't do any of those things. They practice sorcery, incantation, and all kinds of duplicitous traits that are meant merely to enrich themselves and they'll lead to the destruction of the community, right? These sorts of things. But if you think about it critically and we sort of step back, you realize that there's much overlap between those materials and activities that are traditionally labeled magical, even the figures who are at the center of them, the various ritual experts that perform these deeds, and those that we sometimes traditionally think of as religious. And the fact is that we have lots of material from the ancient world that we have um, traditionally called magical that bears much resemblance to the sort of things that the ecclesiastical authorities of early Christianity, for example, are doing, or that mimic what we find in the celebration of various saints on their feast days. Materials like spells and incantations, even curses that evoke the Christian God, the Jewish God, angelic names, alongside sometimes traditional gods or goddesses like Isis or Osiris, in order to preserve the health of a person or safeguard them against demonic assailants or whatever the thing might be, right? So I think it's really important to consider this wider context of ritual activities when we assess the life of any religious community, in part because the view of religion that we get when we limit ourselves just to those sources that have been transmitted historically by ecclesiastical authority or monastic scribes, the voice of the elite who are highly trained and highly literate, we're actually getting a very limited perspective on how people engaged in religious life for very ordinary purposes on local and regional ways, not in the sense of a kind of not in an effort to develop a coherent system and enjoin it upon people in a certain way, right? So one example I usually talk about with students is ask them to think how many people in the ancient world are really literate or have the means to have access to something like the Gospels, right, of Jesus. Most people encounter it in some performative setting, and various components of it are excerpted and marshaled to different purposes. But far more often, if a person, say by the 5th century, is encountering text from the Gospels, it's on an amulet that they might have folded up and worn around their neck to safeguard them, against illness, against you know, sexual assailants, even against demonic threats, all sorts of things. And so, what role does that amulet play in conditioning them to think about the text as sacred? Right. So it's involving these materials in those larger questions. That's what I find really fascinating.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. Thank you for sharing that with us. So we kind of talked a little bit about how religious studies is interdisciplinary. So, in your perspective, in what ways do you see religious studies intersecting with other academic disciplines? And how do you sort of encourage that in your work?
Mhm.
It's kind of a two-part question, but
Sure.
within this interdisciplinary lens, are there any emerging trends or areas of study within religious studies that you find particularly promising? So
Definitely.
yeah.
Yeah. So I'll talk about this both from the perspective of my work and maybe scholarship generally, and then what I think is a student can gain from studying religion academically in a context like Penn State. So let me start actually with the student. I find religious studies to be one of the most interdisciplinary majors, minors that any student can undertake. Because again, this category, religion, is something that, at least in theory, touches every aspect of human life. And so it's been approached from every single direction. I mean, back as an undergrad, when I first considered writing an honors thesis, I actually wanted to write it on the neuroscience of religion. I ended up not doing that, but that was a perfectly viable topic, and students can actually pursue something like this if they wish, or they can take a more philosophical route, or they can, study it historically. They can take courses in anthropology, certainly. I mean, it's all over the place. So it's a nice way if one wants to learn as much as they can about the development of human life and societies, and the ways that different peoples and times and places have tried to answer some of the big questions about life, even some of the small questions about life. It's a good way to focus those various disciplines. In terms of scholarship, what I really like about religious studies is that, on the one hand, it can be very focused in the way that historical studies tend to be on a particular region, let's say, a particular time or place. But it's also quite broad and can be comparative. And sometimes it has to be comparative because the materials available to us are quite limited. But we want to be able to describe a phenomenon, let's say something like sacrifice, that's much more widely distributed across cultures. And so it's useful occasionally to look across various cultures and see what is happening there so that we can develop a better understanding of sacrifice as a thing that humans do, in order for me to be able to say more about, say, sacrifice in Second Temple Judaism or whatever the case may be. So I really enjoy that it's a little bit of both. And in terms of, promising trends, actually, I mean, the field of magic, at least in early Christianity, is starting to find new vigor. Um, Once upon a time, around the 70s, it was this kind of emerging field, and especially thanks to the work of Morton Smith, who published this famous book, or maybe infamous, depending on how you look at it, Jesus the Magician, made the argument that the historical Jesus was effectively an ancient magician, whose story had been changed and modified by the gospel authors to increasingly present him more as a miracle worker rather than face accusations of being some type of a charlatan or something like this. So much of the thesis of that book has not stood the test of time, but it was useful in invigorating this kind of interest in how does the small scale ritual life of Christians and the so-called magical materials help us to understand the emergence of this tradition. And then we haven't seen a whole lot since then, but recently, I think, corresponding with the material turn in history, where people are asking questions about how cultural ideas are embodied in material artifacts, how texts are transmitted and passed through various hands in material institutions, is drawing new attention once again on the magical corpus. And here too, one must be somewhat comparative to think about, for example, the power of the written word, or the magical efficacy of images, and various other questions that we can ask of this material. So it's a little bit of both, right? And it can be very interdisciplinary and marshal resources from a number of different fields to make sense of this very complex material.
Yeah. Thank you. I have one more question for you.
Mhm.
You gave us, a perspective from a student, but as a student myself, I'm
Mhm.
curious if you have any advice, um, for those pursuing religious studies,
Mhm.
maybe in undergrad, also in graduate level, again, specifically within a secular academic setting.
Yes. So one thing I would say to students is, do take advantage of the fact that the field is comparative and broad. Right. So oftentimes, at least in my experience, or maybe it's the courses I teach, I find students are interested in religion, but really they're interested in one particular religious tradition, or perhaps one single facet of religions, generally speaking. And that's all good. I mean, study what you're interested in, but it will, I think, really help to step outside of what's familiar. Say, for example, take a course on Buddhism if you're really interested in Christianity, or take a course on Islam if you've never heard anything about it, right? I think that aids in a couple different ways, right? One is you become much more familiar with a tradition that you know little about, and in this way, round out your knowledge of religious traditions. But number two, in being less familiar with that tradition, you're more open to understanding how the field of religious studies works, right? And employing the kind of critical and academic methods that we use across the board. And sometimes that can be challenging with the materials that we're most familiar with, right? So my advice to students always is, go broad, explore. I mean, there's so much out there. And in addition to that, I would, one more thing I'd add there is if you find, professors or topics that intrigue you, especially, follow them, right? Take more courses with them. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about religious studies is in as much as you want to be broad, you can also tailor it to your own specific interest. And there's always more to explore.
Thank you. I love that. Well, it has been lovely talking to you. Your research is utterly fascinating, and I'm sad that I didn't get a chance to take a course with you. But thank you again for letting me interview you. Thank you. Yeah.